Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrich, the alternate historian. Season 2 of The Man in the High Castle premieres on Amazon this week, and to celebrate, I decided to do a plausibility review of Philip K. Dick's original novel of the same name.
What's a plausibility review, you might ask? Well, in case you haven't seen the one I did on 11/22/63, this is where I analyze just the alternate setting of a book and ignore the plot. I'm going to nitpick all of the divergences the Man in the High Castle's timeline takes from our own, and decide whether or not it is plausible.
With that said, let's dive into one of the most famous World War II alternate histories ever written.
The Man in the High Castle's point of divergence is U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt's assassination in 1933. In our timeline, Italian immigrant Giuseppe Joe Zangara opened fire at a speech Roosevelt was giving in Miami, Florida. Although Roosevelt lived, Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak was killed. In the timeline of The Man in the High Castle, FDR takes a bullet and dies before he even began his presidency. FDR being assassinated is actually a popular point of divergence in alternate history. Works that make use of it include Eric Norden's The Ultimate Solution, Brendan Du Bois' American Eagle, and the GURPS alternate Earth's role-playing game setting Reich 5. All of these works present a darker version of America if FDR was assassinated in 1933. But is this likely?
Dick implies that an FDR-less America would mean a continuation of the Great Depression and a reaffirmation of isolation. Presumably, FDR's vice president, John Nance Garner, would become president after he was assassinated. Garner was more conservative than FDR and imposed many aspects of the New Deal.
For those who don't know, the New Deal was a series of programs instituted during the Roosevelt administration in response to the Great Depression. It was designed to provide relief to the poor and unemployed, stimulate the economy, and reform the financial system to prevent another depression. Even today, it has a major impact on America by creating institutions like the Social Security system and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Dick seems to be implying that without the New Deal, America would not be in a fit state to fight the Axis. To be fair, there's a lot of debate among historians about whether the New Deal actually helped pull America out of the Great Depression. Proponents argue it preserved capitalism and democracy in America, while opponents criticize it for increasing the debt and creating a massively inefficient federal bureaucracy. Often, whether you believe the New Deal was beneficial or harmful depends on your personal politics, but you can at least make an argument that without it, the America imagined in Man in the High Castle could exist and not be strong enough to deal with the Axis powers.
In The Man in the High Castle, the United States never initiates an oil embargo against Japan for its occupation of French Indochina, which is today made up of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Without the oil embargo, Japan never attacks Pearl Harbor, and thus America is never brought into World War II.
It's here where Dick seems to be implying that the Allies never could have won the war without America's help. Much like the New Deal, this is another topic open for debate. While America's vast natural resources and industrial capacity were certainly important for the Allied war effort, it does seem like the Soviet Union does not get enough credit for their part in the war. We shouldn't forget that the Eastern Front was decisive in Nazi Germany's defeat. In fact, the Soviets paid a huge butcher bill to win the fight, with estimates putting almost half the deaths of World War II on those bloody battlefields. This certainly dwarfs any loss of life America suffered in North Africa, Italy, or during the invasion of Normandy. That said, one can still argue that the Soviets could not have lasted as long as they did without material aid from the Western Allies, or new fronts being opened up to prevent Germany from focusing entirely on the Eastern Front. Thus, to paraphrase Dale Cozart, World War II was at least a team effort, and while you can make the argument that the USSR could defeat the Nazis on their own, you can also argue, as Dick did in The Man in the High Castle, that without America's help, nothing would stop Germany and Japan from dividing the world between each other. This would leave the United States alone against the victorious Axis powers, and in The Man in the High Castle, America is defeated and occupied by them in 1947.
And I'm going to stop myself right there. This is the silliest idea Dick had, and while I know you couldn't have The Man in the High Castle without it, this is where plausibility is thrown out the window. Anywho, you may continue.
Thanks, me. Well, you're right. Even with an economically weak America, I find it hard to believe that Germany, who couldn't even invade an island that some have managed to swim to, could somehow invade a continent on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Japan did a bit better in our timeline by occupying some of Alaska's Aleutian Islands, but launching an invasion of the continental United States in the 1940s is ridiculously optimistic. Supplying the Axis armies would be a nightmare and would require forward operating bases the Axis just didn't have and probably never would, even with a victory against Britain and the Soviet Union. Even if America's military might is not what it was in our timeline, the Axis armies would still need to deal with nations like Canada and a well-armed American civilian population who knew the land a lot better than the invaders did. On top of all that, the Axis nations would still need to wage a war in the Americas and defend their newly conquered territories from any rebellions. This, of course, is assuming nuclear bombs are a factor as well, since a nuclear-armed America will put the kibosh on any invasion attempts.
Now, in our timeline, Hitler did believe a confrontation between the Third Reich and America was inevitable. But even Hitler thought that Germany would need time to build up its navy, design new weapons, and even find forward bases to launch an invasion from. But by 1947, just not plausible.
I could end this plausibility review here, but we still need to talk about how the 1960s are portrayed in The Man in the High Castle. In this alternate timeline, Japan and Nazi Germany are the world's competing superpowers, much like how the United States and the Soviet Union were rivals during our timeline's Cold War. Meanwhile, the former United States is divided in the West by Japan's American puppet state, the Pacific States of America, with Eastern America occupied by the Nazis and a possible independent South, although the book is not clear on that. Nevertheless, this reflects how Germany was divided by the Western Allies and the Soviet Union in our timeline. Additionally, the Rocky Mountain states serve as a neutral buffer zone between the two superpowers. Elsewhere in Europe, Adolf Hitler, though alive, has been driven mad by syphilis, and top-ranking Nazis are competing to be the next Fuhrer, with one faction wanting to launch a nuclear first strike on Japan.
In my humble opinion, this is a legit depiction of a dystopia created by the victorious Axis powers, but there are parts where Dick takes it a little too far.
For example, we learn that the Nazis have drained the Mediterranean Sea to make farmland. Now, in our timeline, there was a plan by German architect Hermann Sorgel to dam the Straits of Gibraltar, to not only provide cheap hydroelectric power, but also to open up new land for farming as the Mediterranean Sea retreated. This idea, along with plans to flood parts of Africa to irrigate the Sahara, was christened Atlantropa. If this sounds like a plan a mad scientist would come up with, you're right, which maybe explains why Dick thought the Nazis would do it in The Man in the High Castle. But it's still a dumb idea. Not only would it disrupt shipping by closing the Mediterranean from the Atlantic and make many port cities obsolete, but any land created from the retreating sea would just be salt flats that couldn't support agriculture. Let's also not forget all the people who would be displaced as well. Even factoring in how crazy the Nazis really were, I can't believe they would actually do this.
But then again, I reside in a timeline where someone who doesn't believe in global warming is being put in charge of the EPA. So what do I know?
Something that is a little more believable in The Man in the High Castle is the state of German rocket technology. In the book, the Germans had designed rockets to colonize the Moon, Venus, and Mars. Now, in our timeline, the Germans were ahead of the world in rocket technology thanks in part to rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, who had ambitious plans for space exploration, and even collaborated with Walt Disney to promote them. Nevertheless, his ideas, like a permanent lunar base or building a spacecraft fleet to travel to Mars, were far-fetched and beyond the limits of technology at the time. Perhaps in a world where we had an Axis victory, we might see von Braun get greater funding to pursue his ideas, but colonization of planets by the 1960s comes off more like pulp sci-fi nonsense. I think I will now end my analysis here. There's a lot more I can nitpick on the setting, or I could even analyze the alternate history within the alternate history. The grasshopper lies heavy, but I think you get my point. Although often grounded in reality, The Man in the High Castle requires a lot of suspension of disbelief to take its setting seriously. It is sadly an implausible alternate history, but much like I said in 11/22/63, you should still read it if you get the chance. It's an interesting story about regular people living in a terrible world trying to figure out the nature of reality. Even if that is not your cup of tea, The Man in the High Castle is still one of the most influential alternate histories in fiction, and if only for historical curiosity's sake, you should check it out.
Well, that is what I have to say on the subject. If you like what I do, please comment, subscribe, share this video, or support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrich, the Alternate Historian. Bye!